Can you imagine your best friend weighing 800 pounds and standing over 7 feet tall? Most people would run screaming in the opposite direction. But what if I told you that this massive creature, capable of crushing a human skull with a single swipe, chose to spend his days playing games, sharing meals, and even celebrating birthdays with a man who risked everything to save him? This isn't a fairy tale or a Hollywood movie. This is the true story of Casey Anderson and Brutus, a friendship that defied every law of nature and changed how the world sees one of its most feared predators. Picture this. You're walking through the dense forests of Montana, snow crunching beneath your feet, when suddenly you hear a low rumble behind you. You turn around and come face to face with a massive grizzly bear. Your heart stops. Your legs freeze. Every survival instinct screams at you to run. But instead of attacking, this 400-kilogram giant gently nudges you with his massive head, asking for a belly rub. Sounds impossible, right? Well, for one man, this was just another Tuesday afternoon with his best friend. The story I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you thought you knew about wild animals. Friendship and the courage it takes to follow your heart when the entire world is telling you you're wrong. It's a story that made headlines around the globe, brought grown men to tears on national television, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous creatures are the ones who teach us how to love the most. But before we dive into this incredible journey, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt a connection so strong with another living being that you were willing to risk everything for them? Have you ever looked into the eyes of a creature and seen not a monster, but a soul that understood you better than any human ever could? If you have, then you'll understand why Casey Anderson made a decision that would change his life forever and turn him into one of the most controversial figures in wildlife conservation. This isn't just a story about a man and a bear. This is a story about breaking barriers, challenging prejudices, and proving that love has no boundaries. It's about a bond so pure and so powerful that it moved mountains, changed laws, and inspired millions of people around the world to see wildlife in a completely different light. So buckle up, because you're about to witness one of the most extraordinary friendships in human history. Deep in the heart of Montana, where the Rocky Mountains pierce the sky like ancient cathedrals and the wilderness stretches endlessly in every direction, lived a man whose life was about to be transformed by an unlikely encounter. Casey Anderson wasn't your typical wildlife enthusiast. He was a man who had dedicated his entire existence to understanding and protecting the creatures that most people feared. His home wasn't a suburban house with a white picket fence. It was a 200-acre sanctuary called Grizzly Encounter, nestled in the rugged terrain of Bozeman, Montana. Casey had always been different. While other kids his age were playing video games and watching cartoons, he was out in the wilderness, studying animal behavior and learning the ancient art of coexistence with nature's most powerful predators. His fascination with grizzly bears began in childhood, when he first encountered one of these magnificent creatures during a camping trip with his father. That moment, staring into the intelligent eyes of a wild grizzly, changed everything for him. Years later, Casey had transformed his passion into a mission. Grizzly Encounter wasn't just a wildlife sanctuary. It was a bridge between two worlds. It was a place where humans could come to understand that the creatures they feared were actually complex, intelligent beings, capable of emotions, relationships, and even love. Casey's work wasn't about taming wild animals or turning them into entertainment. It was about education, conservation, and proving that coexistence was possible. The sanctuary was a masterpiece of natural design. Sprawling meadows provided space for the bears to roam freely, while dense forests offered shelter and privacy. Crystal-clear streams wound their way through the property, providing fresh water and perfect fishing spots. It was as close to a wild environment as possible while still allowing for human interaction and education. Casey had spent years perfecting this balance, creating a space where bears could be bears, while also serving as ambassadors for their species. Every morning, Casey would wake up before dawn, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the gentle rumbling of his massive residence. His daily routine involved feeding, monitoring, and interacting with several rescued grizzly bears, each with their own unique personality and story. Some had been orphaned as cubs, others rescued from inappropriate captivity. Each one had found a second chance at Grizzly Encounter, and Casey treated them not as animals in his care, but as family members with their own rights and dignity. But Casey's work wasn't without controversy. Many in the scientific community criticized his methods, arguing that close human-bear relationships were dangerous and unnatural. Wildlife officials constantly monitored his activities, and insurance companies charged astronomical rates for coverage. Local communities were divided between those who admired his dedication and those who viewed him as a reckless dreamer putting lives at risk. Despite the criticism, Casey remained steadfast in his mission. He knew that fear was born from ignorance, and ignorance could only be cured through education and understanding. Every day at Grizzly Encounter was an opportunity to show visitors that grizzly bears weren't the mindless killing machines portrayed in movies and sensationalized news stories. They were intelligent, emotional, and surprisingly gentle creatures when treated with respect and understanding. If stories like this move you, be part of our wild-hearted community. Subscribe now for more emotional, true stories. The winter of 2002 brought an unexpected challenge to Grizzly Encounter that would test everything Casey believed about wildlife conservation and the bonds between species. Deep in the Yellowstone ecosystem, a mother grizzly had given birth to twin cubs during hibernation. But when spring arrived and the family emerged from their den, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The mother, weakened by a harsh winter and struggling to find enough food to produce milk, was unable to care for both cubs. In the wild, this scenario often plays out with heartbreaking predictability. The mother will typically abandon the weaker cub to ensure the survival of the stronger one. It's nature's harsh mathematics of survival, where difficult choices must be made for the greater good of the species. But this time, human intervention changed the equation. Wildlife officials, monitoring the family through radio collars, witnessed the mother's distress and made the difficult decision to remove the weaker cub before he starved to death. The cub, later named Brutus, was just 8 weeks old when he was brought to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. He weighed barely 5 pounds. His eyes still held the innocent blue color of very young bears, and his tiny paws could fit in the palm of a human hand. But despite his small size, there was something remarkable about this little bear. The veterinarians and wildlife specialists who examined him were struck by his calm demeanor and unusual willingness to make eye contact with humans. However, Brutus faced a grim future. The rehabilitation center was overcrowded, and space for a grizzly bear cub was limited. The standard protocol for orphaned grizzly cubs was either placement in a zoo or, in worst-case scenarios, euthanasia. The center director explained to Casey that they had no choice but to send Brutus to a zoo in the Midwest, where he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete enclosure, far from the mountains and forests that were his birthright. Casey's heart broke as he looked at the tiny cub. Brutus wasn't just another orphaned animal. He was a living symbol of everything that was wrong with how humans treated wildlife. Here was a creature whose only crime was being born into a world where his kind was misunderstood and feared. The thought of this magnificent animal spending his entire life behind bars, never feeling grass beneath his paws or breathing the crisp mountain air, was unbearable. The wildlife officials presented Casey with a choice that would haunt him for weeks. He could take Brutus to Grizzly Encounter, but only temporarily, until a permanent zoo placement could be arranged. The cub would live at the sanctuary for a few months, gain strength and size, and then be shipped off to a life of captivity. It wasn't a real choice at all. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. But as Casey held the tiny cub for the first time, feeling the rapid beating of Brutus's heart against his chest, something extraordinary happened. The cub, who had been crying and restless since his rescue, suddenly became calm. He nuzzled against Casey's neck, made soft chirping sounds, and seemed to find comfort in human contact. It was as if Brutus had chosen Casey as his surrogate parent, trusting this stranger with his life and future. That night, Casey couldn't sleep. He walked the grounds of Grizzly Encounter, thinking about the sleeping cub in the sanctuary's nursery area. Every fiber of his being told him that sending Brutus to a zoo was wrong. This wasn't just about one bear. It was about everything he had dedicated his life to fighting against. It was about a system that saw wild animals as problems to be managed, rather than beings with the right to live with dignity and freedom. The weight of the decision pressed down on Casey like a physical force. He knew that keeping Brutus would mean taking on a lifetime commitment that would change everything about his life and work. A grizzly bear lives for 20 to 25 years in captivity, growing to massive size and requiring constant care, specialized diet, and enormous resources. It would mean facing criticism from wildlife officials, scientific communities, and insurance companies. It would mean putting his sanctuary's reputation and future at risk. But every time Casey considered the alternatives, he came back to the same conclusion. Brutus deserved better than a life of captivity. This cub deserved a chance to experience what it meant to be a bear, even if he could never be truly wild. The decision that Casey made that night would not only save one bear's life, but would also challenge the entire world's perception of what relationships between humans and wildlife could look like. The first year with Brutus was like raising the world's most dangerous toddler. Casey quickly discovered that everything he thought he knew about bears was about to be tested in the most intimate and challenging way possible. Brutus wasn't just growing physically. He was developing a personality that was uniquely his own, and that personality was equal parts endearing and terrifying. At 6 months old, Brutus weighed 80 pounds and had the energy of a hyperactive child. He would wake up every morning at dawn, calling for Casey with soft woofing sounds that grew louder and more insistent until his human companion appeared. Their daily routine began with breakfast, but feeding Brutus was unlike feeding any other animal Casey had ever worked with. The young bear had opinions about his food, preferences for certain fruits, and a mischievous habit of hiding treats around his enclosure like a squirrel preparing for winter. But it was the emotional connection that truly amazed Casey. Brutus seemed to understand human emotions in a way that defied scientific explanation. When Casey was sad or stressed, the bear would gently place his massive paw on Casey's shoulder and make soft, comforting sounds. When Casey was happy and energetic, Brutus would playfully chase him around the enclosure, always careful never to use his full strength or sharp claws. The challenges, however, were immense. As Brutus grew larger and stronger, every interaction became potentially dangerous. A playful swat from a 200-pound adolescent grizzly could easily break bones, and Casey had to develop an entirely new language of communication with his unusual companion. Traditional animal training methods didn't work with Brutus because their relationship wasn't based on dominance or submission. It was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Critics began to emerge from every corner of the wildlife community. Respected biologists published papers arguing that Casey's work was anthropomorphizing dangerous wild animals and giving the public false impressions about bear behavior. Wildlife officials made surprise visits to Grizzly Encounter, looking for any excuse to remove Brutus from Casey's care. Insurance companies threatened to cancel policies, and some former supporters began to distance themselves from the sanctuary. The media attention was equally challenging. Reporters would arrive expecting to see either a man who had tamed a wild bear or a dangerous situation waiting to explode. They struggled to understand that Casey and Brutus's relationship didn't fit into any of their preconceived categories. It wasn't a circus act, a pet relationship, or a scientific study. It was something entirely new, a genuine friendship between two very different species. Local communities were divided. Some neighbors complained about having a dangerous predator living so close to their homes, while others became fascinated by the daily updates Casey would share about Brutus's development. Children would ask their parents if they could visit the friendly bear, while adults worried about safety and liability. Casey found himself defending not just his methods, but his entire philosophy of wildlife conservation. He spent countless hours explaining to visitors, reporters, and officials that Brutus wasn't a pet or a trained performer. The bear retained all of his natural instincts and behaviors. He had simply learned to trust and love a human being in the same way he might have bonded with his biological mother and siblings. The emotional toll was enormous. Casey often questioned whether he had made the right decision, especially during Brutus's adolescent phase when the bear's strength and size made every interaction a calculated risk. There were moments when Casey wondered if the critics were right, if he was being selfish in keeping Brutus rather than sending him to a traditional zoo, where he would be safely contained behind barriers. But then, there would be moments that reminded Casey why he had made this choice. Like the evening when Brutus gently cleaned a cut on Casey's hand with his tongue, or the morning when the bear brought Casey his favorite toy as a gift. or the countless times when Brutus would simply sit beside Casey, both of them watching the sunset over the Montana mountains in comfortable silence. What would you have done in Casey's place? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The moment that would define the rest of Casey Anderson's life came on a crisp autumn morning when Brutus was 2 years old and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Wildlife officials had arrived at Grizzly Encounter with an ultimatum. Either Brutus would be transferred to an accredited zoo within 30 days, or legal action would be taken to remove him by force. The state had received pressure from animal rights groups and insurance companies, and the political climate had shifted against Casey's unconventional approach to wildlife conservation. Casey stood in Brutus's enclosure, watching his massive friend play with a rubber ball, completely oblivious to the human drama swirling around his future. The bear had grown into a magnificent specimen, with glossy brown fur, intelligent dark eyes, and a gentle demeanor that continued to surprise everyone who met him. But to the officials, Brutus represented a liability, a dangerous wild animal that belonged behind concrete walls and steel bars, not living in semi-freedom with a human companion. The decision Casey made that day would ripple through the wildlife conservation community for years to come. Instead of surrendering Brutus to the system, he chose to fight back in the most powerful way he knew how, by proving to the world that everything they believed about grizzly bears was wrong. He would transform Grizzly Encounter from a simple wildlife sanctuary into a revolutionary educational platform that would challenge people's deepest fears and prejudices about wildlife. Casey's plan was audacious and risky. He would take Brutus out into the public eye, not as a circus act or entertainment, but as a living ambassador for his species. They would appear at educational events, work with filmmakers and photographers, and demonstrate that the relationship between humans and wildlife didn't have to be defined by fear and domination. It was a strategy that required Casey to put everything on the line: his reputation, his safety, and his life's work. The first public appearance was at a local elementary school, where Casey had been invited to speak about wildlife conservation. When he announced that he would be bringing Brutus, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some parents demanded that the event be canceled, while others were curious to see this famous bear-human duo for themselves. The school board held emergency meetings, insurance companies were consulted, and safety protocols were established. On the day of the presentation, Casey arrived at the school with Brutus in a specially designed transport vehicle. As they walked into the gymnasium together, the reaction was electric. Children gasped in amazement, teachers stood frozen in fascination and fear, and parents reached for their cameras and their children in equal measure. But what happened next would be talked about in that community for years to come. Brutus, instead of displaying any aggressive behavior, seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He walked calmly beside Casey, occasionally looking at the crowd with curious but gentle eyes. When Casey asked him to sit, Brutus complied immediately. When children asked questions about what bears like to eat, Brutus demonstrated by delicately taking pieces of fruit from Casey's hand with the gentleness of a dog accepting treats. The transformation in the room was palpable. Children who had arrived terrified of the monster bear were raising their hands to ask if they could give Brutus a snack. Parents who had come prepared to file complaints were instead taking photos and asking Casey about his conservation work. Teachers were already planning follow-up lessons about wildlife preservation and the importance of understanding rather than fearing wild animals. But Casey knew that one successful school visit wasn't enough to change the system or save Brutus from eventual zoo placement. He needed to reach a much larger audience and create a groundswell of public support that would be impossible for wildlife officials to ignore. The solution came from an unexpected source: a documentary filmmaker who had heard about Casey and Brutus's unique relationship and wanted to tell their story to the world. The decision to participate in the documentary was another leap of faith. Casey knew that once their story was broadcast nationally, there would be no going back. They would become either heroes or cautionary tales, depending on how the public responded to their unconventional friendship. But Casey also knew that this might be their only chance to prove that there was another way to think about wildlife conservation, one based on understanding and respect rather than fear and control. As Casey watched Brutus playing in the late afternoon sunlight, completely trusting and content, He made a promise that would guide every decision for the rest of their journey together. He would never allow this magnificent creature to be reduced to a zoo exhibit or a political pawn. Brutus would live with dignity, freedom, and love, no matter what it cost Casey personally. It was a promise that would soon be tested on the biggest stage in American media. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March 2005. Casey was feeding Brutus his breakfast when his assistant rushed over with news that seemed too incredible to believe. Oprah Winfrey's producers wanted to feature Casey and Brutus on her show. The Oprah Winfrey Show was the most watched daytime television program in America, reaching millions of viewers daily and having the power to make or break careers, movements, and causes with a single episode. For Casey, this wasn't just an opportunity. It was the chance to reach more people in 1 hour than he could educate in years of local presentations. But it was also terrifying. Oprah's show wasn't a controlled environment like Grizzly Encounter. It would be a live television studio filled with hundreds of people, bright lights, cameras, and all the unpredictable energy that came with such a massive production. Taking Brutus, now weighing over 400 pounds, into that environment would be the ultimate test of their bond and trust. The weeks leading up to the appearance were filled with intense preparation. Casey worked with Brutus daily, exposing him to loud noises, bright lights, and crowds of people to prepare him for the television studio environment. They practiced walking on different surfaces, sitting calmly while surrounded by strangers, and responding to Casey's commands even when distracted by unusual sights and sounds. Every training session was crucial because there would be no second chances on live television. When the day finally arrived, Casey and Brutus flew to Chicago, accompanied by a team of veterinarians, animal handlers, and insurance representatives. The backstage area at Harpo Studios was electric with nervous energy. Oprah's staff had never had a grizzly bear as a guest, and despite extensive planning, everyone was aware that they were entering uncharted territory. But when the cameras rolled and Oprah introduced Casey and Brutus to her audience, something magical happened. Brutus walked onto the stage with the calm confidence of a seasoned performer, seemingly unfazed by the bright lights and enthusiastic applause. As Casey began telling their story, Brutus lay down beside Oprah's chair, occasionally looking at the audience with what could only be described as gentle curiosity. The audience was mesmerized. Here was a creature that weighed as much as 4 adult men, with claws that could shred steel and jaws powerful enough to crush bones. And yet he was displaying the gentle demeanor of a beloved family pet. When Oprah nervously reached out to touch Brutus's fur, the bear remained perfectly still, allowing her to experience the incredible softness of his coat while Casey explained the complex emotional life of grizzly bears. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The show's phone lines were flooded with calls from viewers wanting to know more about grizzly bear conservation. Animal sanctuaries across the country reported increases in donations and volunteer applications. Most importantly, wildlife officials who had been pressuring Casey to give up Brutus found themselves facing a public relations nightmare, as thousands of people wrote letters demanding that Brutus be allowed to remain at Grizzly Encounter. But the real impact came from the viewers themselves. Parents wrote to tell Casey how their children had overcome their fear of wild animals after watching the show. Teachers developed new curriculum about wildlife conservation inspired by Brutus's story. Researchers began studying the possibility of positive human-wildlife relationships in ways they had never considered before. The National Geographic Channel, which had been following the story since the Oprah appearance, offered Casey and Brutus their own documentary special. This wasn't just a one-time appearance. It was an opportunity to create a lasting educational resource that could reach classrooms, libraries, and homes around the world. The documentary Expedition Grizzly would follow Casey and Brutus as they traveled through the American wilderness, demonstrating how humans and wildlife could coexist peacefully. The success of the National Geographic documentary led to more opportunities than Casey had ever imagined. Educational institutions across the country began inviting them to speak. Wildlife conservation organizations that had once criticized Casey's methods began asking for his advice on human-wildlife conflict resolution. International media outlets wanted to feature their story, spreading their message of understanding and coexistence to audiences around the globe. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on policy. State wildlife officials, facing overwhelming public support for Casey and Brutus, began reconsidering their rigid policies about human-wildlife interaction. New guidelines were developed that allowed for educational programs like Grizzly Encounter while maintaining appropriate safety standards. Brutus had become more than an ambassador for his species. He had become a catalyst for changing how society thought about wildlife conservation. If this moment touched your heart, show your support by liking this video. It truly helps us continue sharing stories like this. Behind the cameras and media attention, the true magic of Casey and Brutus's relationship revealed itself in countless small moments that spoke to the depth of their connection. These weren't the dramatic scenes that made headlines, but rather the quiet, intimate exchanges that proved their bond transcended the typical boundaries between human and wild animal. Every morning began the same way. Casey would arrive at Brutus's enclosure before dawn, and the massive bear would greet him with soft, rumbling vocalizations that sounded remarkably like a cat's purr. Brutus had developed his own way of saying good morning, gently pressing his enormous head against Casey's chest while making contented sounds deep in his throat. For Casey, these moments were more precious than any media appearance or public recognition. Brutus displayed an uncanny ability to read Casey's emotions and respond accordingly. On days when Casey was stressed about sanctuary operations or worried about funding, Brutus would become unusually gentle and attentive, often bringing Casey his favorite stick or simply sitting close enough that his presence provided comfort. When Casey was happy and energetic, Brutus would become playful, initiating games of chase or wrestling that required incredible trust and communication between both participants. One of the most remarkable aspects of their relationship was how Brutus protected Casey, not from external threats but from his own tendency to push too hard. During long workdays at the sanctuary, Brutus would position himself between Casey and whatever task was demanding his attention, essentially forcing his human friend to take breaks. It was as if the bear understood that Casey's well-being was essential to both of their futures. Their play sessions were a masterclass in interspecies communication. Brutus, who could easily crush Casey with minimal effort, had learned to modulate his strength perfectly. During wrestling matches, he would use just enough force to make the game interesting, while being careful never to scratch Casey with his claws or bite with his powerful jaws. Casey, in turn, had learned to read Brutus's body language so precisely that he could tell when the bear was getting too excited and needed to calm down. Perhaps the most touching tradition was their birthday celebrations. Casey would prepare special meals for Brutus's birthday, complete with a cake made from the bear's favorite fruits and honey. Brutus, in turn, seemed to understand the significance of these occasions, displaying what could only be described as excitement and anticipation. On Casey's birthday, Brutus would often present him with gifts, interesting rocks, pieces of wood, or flowers that he had carefully selected and brought to share. The trust between them was absolute and mutual. Casey could reach into Brutus's mouth to remove something dangerous without fear of being bitten. Brutus could fall asleep next to Casey, completely vulnerable and relaxed, trusting that his human friend would keep him safe. This level of trust had been built over years of consistent, respectful interaction, and had never been betrayed by either party. Visitors to Grizzly Encounter were often moved to tears, watching Casey and Brutus interact. They would see Casey sitting quietly in the enclosure, reading a book while Brutus lay nearby, occasionally looking up from his own activities to check on his friend. The peace and contentment visible in both human and bear challenged every preconception about wild animals being inherently dangerous or unpredictable. But the relationship wasn't without its challenges. As Brutus aged and his health began to decline, Casey faced the heartbreaking reality that their time together was limited. Grizzly bears in captivity typically live 20 to 25 years, and Brutus was approaching his 20th birthday. Casey began each day with the knowledge that it might be one of their last together, making every interaction even more precious. The depth of their emotional connection became most apparent during Brutus's final months. The aging bear, who had always been Casey's source of strength and comfort, seemed to understand that his human friend was struggling with the approaching loss. Brutus would spend hours simply sitting close to Casey, offering the gift of his presence and the comfort of their shared silence. Casey would later say that Brutus taught him more about love, loyalty, and living in the moment than any human relationship ever had. The bear never asked for anything more than respect, kindness, and consistency. In return, he offered unconditional love, protection, and a friendship that defied every scientific explanation, but felt more real and meaningful than anything else in Casey's life. The impact of Casey and Brutus's friendship extended far beyond their personal relationship, creating ripples that touched conservation efforts, educational programs, and wildlife policies across the globe. Their story became a powerful tool for changing public perception about grizzly bears and other apex predators, transforming fear-based narratives into stories of understanding and coexistence. Educational institutions from elementary schools to universities began incorporating their story into curricula about wildlife conservation, environmental science, and even social studies programs about breaking down prejudices and stereotypes. The Grizzly Encounter Sanctuary became a model for other wildlife facilities, demonstrating that conservation could be both effective and emotionally meaningful when built on relationships of respect rather than dominance. The conservation impact was measurable and significant. Before Casey and Brutus's story gained national attention, grizzly bear populations in the lower 48 states were still recovering from decades of persecution and habitat loss. Public support for grizzly bear conservation was limited, with many rural communities viewing bears as dangerous pests rather than important ecological keystone species. The visibility that Brutus brought to grizzly bear conservation helped generate funding for habitat protection, research programs, and conflict prevention initiatives. International wildlife organizations began studying the grizzly encounter model for potential application in other countries facing human-wildlife conflict. Conservation groups in places like Romania, where brown bear populations were struggling with human encroachment, sent representatives to Montana to learn from Casey's approach. The idea that positive relationships between humans and large predators were possible began to influence conservation strategies worldwide. Casey leveraged their fame to support other wildlife conservation causes, using Brutus's popularity to draw attention to threatened species and environmental issues that might otherwise have been ignored by mainstream media. Their platform became a voice for wolves, mountain lions, and other predators that suffered from similar misunderstanding and persecution. The policy changes inspired by their work were equally significant. Wildlife agencies that had once maintained strict policies against any form of human-wildlife interaction began developing more nuanced guidelines that allowed for educational programs while maintaining safety standards. The success of Grizzly Encounter provided evidence that alternative approaches to wildlife management could be both safe and effective. Perhaps most importantly, Casey and Brutus inspired a new generation of wildlife conservationists who understood that effective conservation required not just scientific knowledge, but also emotional connection. Young people who had grown up hearing their story entered careers in biology, wildlife management, and environmental education, with a different perspective on the relationship between humans and nature. The sanctuary itself became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand what positive human-wildlife relationships could look like. Visitors from around the world traveled to Montana to witness firsthand the peaceful coexistence that Casey and Brutus had demonstrated. Many left with changed perspectives not just about bears, but about their own relationship with the natural world. When Brutus passed away in 2021 at the age of 19, the outpouring of grief from around the world demonstrated the profound impact their friendship had made. Memorial tributes came from children who had never met Brutus, but felt they knew him through Casey's stories, from scientists who had been inspired to study human-wildlife relationships, and from conservation organizations that credited Brutus with helping to change public policy toward predator protection. The Brutus Legacy Foundation, established after his death, continues to support grizzly bear research and conservation efforts worldwide. Educational programs based on their story reach thousands of students annually, teaching new generations that wildlife conservation is most effective when it's built on understanding, respect, and love rather than fear and control. Where in the world are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. We're building a global tribe of wildlife lovers. As we reflect on the extraordinary journey of Casey Anderson and Brutus, their story offers profound lessons that extend far beyond wildlife conservation into the very heart of what it means to be human in relationship with the natural world. Their friendship challenged fundamental assumptions about the barriers between species and demonstrated that love, respect, and understanding could bridge even the most unlikely gaps. Brutus was never just a bear in Casey's eyes, and Casey was never just a human in Brutus's world. They were teacher and student to each other, protector and protected, friend and family. Their relationship proved that the artificial boundaries we create between human and animal, civilized and wild, safe and dangerous, are often based more on fear and misunderstanding than on reality. The courage that Casey showed in defending their friendship, even when faced with criticism from experts and officials, reminds us that sometimes the most important truths can only be discovered by those willing to step outside conventional wisdom and follow their hearts. His decision to risk everything for one orphaned bear cub created a legacy that continues to influence how we think about wildlife conservation, animal intelligence, and the possibilities for peaceful coexistence. The power of empathy that their story demonstrates offers hope for addressing many of the challenges facing our world today. If a human and a grizzly bear could learn to understand and love each other, perhaps we can find ways to bridge the divides that separate communities, nations, and cultures. Their friendship serves as a reminder that connection is possible even across the most fundamental differences when it's built on a foundation of respect and genuine care. Brutus taught Casey, and through him taught all of us, that the most dangerous creatures are often the ones who teach us how to love the most. By choosing to see beyond fear and prejudice, Casey discovered a friendship that enriched his life immeasurably and changed the world's understanding of what relationships between humans and wildlife could look like. Their legacy lives on in every conservation program that chooses education over elimination, in every wildlife policy that considers the emotional and social needs of animals, and in every person who looks at a wild creature and sees not a threat to be feared, but a being deserving of understanding and respect. As we face an uncertain future for wildlife around the globe, the example of Casey and Brutus reminds us that conservation is ultimately about relationships. It's about recognizing that we share this planet with creatures who are capable of love, loyalty, friendship, and trust. It's about understanding that our survival and theirs are interconnected, and that the health of our ecosystems depends on our willingness to see beyond our fears and embrace the possibility of coexistence. The story of Casey and Brutus proves that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single act of love and courage. Casey's decision to save one orphaned bear cub created ripples that continue to spread around the world, inspiring new approaches to conservation and new ways of thinking about our relationship with nature. If you've made it this far in their story, you're part of a community that believes in the power of understanding over fear, love over hatred, and hope over despair. Thank you for taking this journey with us and for being part of a movement that sees the beauty and possibility in the connections between all living beings. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story to the very end. Your commitment to hearing about the bond between Casey and Brutus shows that you're exactly the kind of person who understands that the most powerful changes in our world often begin with a single act of love and courage. If their friendship moved you, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't miss our next amazing true story that's coming up right now. Hit that subscribe button and let your heart guide you to another incredible journey that will remind you why the connections between all living beings are so precious and powerful. The next story waiting for you is just as inspiring and will show you another side of the amazing relationships that exist in our natural world.